And we're going to be talking about the evidence that we did not cover in cold case Christianity. What's great about that is this is a perfect companion piece to that book. But if you're somebody, or you know somebody who says, I'm not even willing to open the pages of the New Testament, well, I want to show you why history would still leave you with the same information about Jesus. So here is the first takeaway, the first kind of impact that Jesus had on history. Here it is. You got to remember that Jesus had more impact on culture than anyone else in history. Jesus matters. Jesus matters in all those areas that you might think Jesus has no role at all. Look, as an atheist, I would have said that the things that matter most to me, I was somebody who was raised in the arts, just personally, this is the stuff that I found to be very valuable. Literature, art, music, education, science, those things were incredibly important to me. Well, it turns out that Jesus and his followers really impacted these 5 areas so deeply that we can say with true sincerity that we are where we are in history in those 5 areas because of Jesus and his followers. That's right, I know that sounds like a controversial claim, but if you think you value education, upper education, universities, well, you can thank Jesus and his followers. If you think you value science and everything we've learned of scientific exploration, well, you can thank Jesus and his followers. If you love the arts, literature, music, visual arts, well, you can thank Jesus and his followers. Jesus has inspired more people in those 5 categories than any other historical figure ever. Now, I take the time to go through these in 5 separate chapters. As a matter of fact, I've even got a chapter on world religions, because I want you to see the way that Jesus has impacted the other religions that are embraced around the globe today. As a matter of fact, every other religion will hat tip or recognize Jesus in some way, even though Jesus makes no room for those religions within the sphere of Christianity. They make room for him. Jesus never budges. He never moves. It's his way. He is the only way to the Father. He says it over and over again. He doesn't even acknowledge the other systems. So what I want to say to you is the first takeaway for me as I wrote this book was that if you think that Jesus doesn't matter in 2021, 22, 23, 24, whenever you're watching this, you're mistaken. You don't even know the history of the things that do matter to you. And if you're somebody who rejects theism altogether, I'll bet you the things that do matter to you were strongly influenced by Jesus and his followers. Person of Interest, that book, what we're trying to do is to show the huge, unparalleled, unthinkable impact that Jesus has had in the areas of our culture and our society that we value most. You can thank Jesus and his followers because they happen to be responsible for why we got here. Even in the sciences, even in universities, even in the arts. These are areas. Now, I only picked those areas for another reason. It's not just that Jesus had unparalleled impact on the aspects of culture and society that all of us value most, even if we're not people who believe in God. It's that Jesus also can be reconstructed from all of those categories, from all of those aspects of culture. Here's what I mean. I only chose those aspects of culture from which I could rebuild the story of Jesus. And this is where I think that Person of Interest is incredibly different than the other work that's out there. Look, I've read all these books. I've got them all on my shelves behind me here. Books that talk about the impact that Jesus has had on our society, the impact that Jesus has had on the progress of society. But that's not all I wanted to do. Yeah, okay, Jesus still matters. He does, because he's had a huge impact on every aspect of culture that I, as an atheist, actually valued. But it turns out from those 5 aspects of culture, we could reconstruct the story of Jesus even if every page of the New Testament had been destroyed. Now, I'll show you how we do that in the book. But I will tell you that in the arts, in literature, okay, get rid of all the Christian literature if you want. There's still enough non-Christian literature in the history of literature from which you could reconstruct the elements of the Christian story in their totality, from the virgin birth all the way to the ascension. You could construct all of that from the data points of non-Christians, of people who were hostile to Jesus in the first 300 years. Both Jews and Romans and Greeks and pagans, these folks have left a document trail in which the truth about Jesus can be reconstructed and I've covered this time in this book, everyone in the first 300 centuries, to see what it. Now, the reason why I stopped there is that once Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, I'm out. I only want to know what is being said about Jesus before Rome takes over the faith and ends up, pushing it one direction or another. I want to know, what do the earliest observers and the earliest, I've also included, of course, all of the Christians in that period of time. That's never been done in any of my work. Even though I might reference a little piece of that in Cold Case Christianity, we blew it out for a person of interest. Not only that, we blew it out in terms of all the non-Christian voices that were heard in the first 3 centuries. What did they have to say about Jesus? I think you'll be shocked to see the level of detail you can get from just the literature that's non-Christian literature. Also, though, if you were to reassemble the impact that Jesus had on music, just look at the hymns that were sung by the early church in the first 300 years. I will show you in the book how the entire story of Jesus can be reconstructed from the hymns. And by the way, the influence of Jesus is so pronounced that in every historic period of music, if you study music history, they are broken down into epic periods of time in which there is certain progress in music is made until we get to the contemporary musicians. Well, it turns out that every period of time is dominated by Christ followers who are singing about Jesus. In other words, if you were trying to destroy every remnant of the Jesus story, you'd have to do a lot more than just destroy the pages of the New Testament or any manuscript evidence or any printed Bible. You'd have to also destroy a ton of non-Christian literature over the 2,000-year period. Jesus is the most written about historical figure in all of literature. And you have to destroy the history of music, because Christ followers who wrote about Jesus also made so many innovative choices and decisions. We have musical notation, for example, because of a Christ follower. We have so much of our instrumentation because of Christ followers. But it's not just that. The arts, the visual arts, you can reconstruct the entire gospel just from the visual arts of things that were painted, etched, sculpted, or crafted about Jesus in the first 500 years. You have to destroy the history of art, visual art, of music, of literature. Education and science, I'm going to show you how those two areas that sometimes people think are incompatible with Christianity, right? I mean, you'll see that at the universities today, the name of Jesus is not venerated. But it turns out that those universities are there because of Jesus and his followers. I'll show you that and how to reconstruct the story of Jesus just from universities, and how to reconstruct the entire narrative of Jesus' story from science. Yeah, I know that sounds crazy, but we do this in the book. Why? Because we picked those areas, and from world religions. Look, all those religions that hat tip where their leaders will speak glowingly about Jesus, well, it turns out if you just mine out the data points that all of them have in common about Jesus, you'll get a pretty decent recap of the Jesus story. And you're going to get that from non-Christian religious systems. Look, my point is, I picked out those areas of culture, those areas of history, in which we could actually do more than just show the impact that Jesus had, but we could actually show how we could reconstruct the data points for Jesus. You're not willing probably to destroy the history of music, literature, the arts, science, education, and all other world religions in order to destroy the data we have about Jesus, but you'd have to do just that, because you could reconstruct all of it just from those aspects of culture. And that's why I didn't include some other aspects. Did he have more impact? Yes, he's had more impact than just that. But I wanted to pick those areas in which I could actually glean data points to show you how impossible it would be to erase Jesus from human history. It takes a lot more than just erasing the scriptures. You'd have to erase his impact on our human history, and that would be awfully hard to do, since the things you probably value the most, really you have to hat tip Jesus for all of those. So here's the third thing, the third way that Jesus impacted history. Jesus had the kind of impact on history that actually demonstrates his deity. And I try to cover some of this in the new book, Person of Interest. By the way, you can go to personofinterestbook.com, personofinterestbook.com, to view the information about the new book. Now, I will tell you that as I looked at this, I thought to myself, how could it be? It's not just that these are just localized, Western phenomena in Western civilization. It's that the science that impacts all of us as a human species are indebted to Jesus and his followers. The educational institutions that everyone is coming to from all over the world were attributed. You really have to think they began by Christ followers through the monasteries and the cathedral schools that have developed into the universities. You're going to have a hard... This is not just that Jesus has an impact on the West, or that Jesus had an impact on the art, literature, music, science, education of the West, or religions of the West. No, it turns out Jesus has had an impact on the global aspects of culture. How can this be? There's a lot of other people who could have had a similar impact. And so you just look, and I make a list in the book so you can see to make this case to others, that if you understood who was living in that first century, when all of history slipped from BCE into CE, or from BC into AD, however you want to say it, that all happened. Something happened as a catalyst in the first century to set our calendars. And if you look at all the other people who could have had an impact from the first century, all the other global leaders, well, I've listed them all. I examined all of them, all over the world. From as far east as you want to go to as far west as you want to go, there are a number of historical figures that we could identify in the first century. And if you were to look at all of them, most of them you would say, I don't even know who they are. I don't even recognize those names. Most of them had little or no impact at all on history, let alone in changing our calendars. And if you looked at all of the people in the history of leaders, in the history of important people, forget about the first century, let's just broaden it out. Let's just go through all of human history. Well, I've listed those as well. Take a look at that list in my book. You'll see that none of them had the kind of impact on your calendar or the impact on culture, or the impact on those aspects of culture I described as Jesus of Nazareth. If you looked at all the other people who claimed deity or gods worshipped by either pre-Christians or post-Christians, and I made a list of all those, you can look at those too, none of them have had the kind of impact on those 5 aspects of the culture you so enjoy as Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus uniquely sits at the turning point in history, and Jesus is uniquely responsible for the development of those 5 aspects of culture that most of us value more than anything else. How could that be, given the small part of the world in which Jesus lived, the kind of minor influence that think about? He's born in a small town. He never travels very far. He's accused of being the illegitimate son of a woman who doesn't have much means in terms of financial means, and Jesus certainly never commanded a government or ruled an army. These are not things that Jesus ever was able to do. I mean, compared to the other folks who were in the first century, or who in the course of history had power to change the course of humankind, Jesus has none of that. How could it be that someone who's in such an unassuming position could change the hearts and minds of so many people and have this kind of impact on history? Well, it might just be that he's actually more than a person of interest. And that's what I talk about in the final part of the book. There is good reason to believe that Jesus had this kind of impact on history because Jesus is more than a mere human. No human should have had the kind of impact on history that Jesus had. Yet, he continues to have that kind of impact. And by the way, when I talk about the impact that Jesus has had on areas of culture that some of us think, well, are we still at the forefront of the sciences? Well, in the book, I'll show you why we still are. But we could easily surrender that. We could easily step away from all the universities, step away from upper education, higher education, step away from the sciences. Other groups have done that. And I talk about in the book how, for example, Islam did that in the Middle Ages. Stepped away from their leadership role, stepped away from even a participant role of high stature in the Middle Ages, in the sciences, for example. Well, why did that happen? For theological reasons. Really, it was their understanding of the nature of Allah and his written word that is probably responsible for why they no longer lead in those areas. Well, okay, look, are we going to make a similar decision? We don't have to, because Jesus still matters. That's the point of the book, Person of Interest. Now look, I'm going to make a shameless plug here. I've written a book that I think is very unusual. Like I said, it's part detective novel, it's part graphic novel, it's part personal journey, and it's part case for Christianity. I've never written a book like this. I've never spent this much time crafting it or researching it. The footnote section alone, our endorsers have said, was worth the price of admission. Because it's so robust, we had to even kick it out as to a downloadable PDF. It's just too large. There's twice as many written words in the endnotes than there are in the book itself. So it's very well researched. I hope it'll change the way you see Jesus, change the way you see Christian history, change the way you see human history, and change the way you see the impact that Jesus has had. Jesus still matters. Don't think for a second he doesn't. And you can discover it by reading Person of Interest. Now look, I try to seek out endorsers from all those areas, those 5 or 6 areas of culture that matter to us. I started to seek out and have people read the book who were artists and give me input. Artists, scientists, educators, writers, musicians. I reached out to all of these different groups because I wanted them to tell me, am I right or am I wrong about this? Do you see what I'm seeing? And it turns out, you'll see from the endorsements, that people believe that this book accurately describes who Jesus was in history. I hope, and look, I know I don't spend a lot of time shamelessly plugging my books, even though that's what I consider myself to be as an author. But this book, I have never spent as much time on any. I thought after I wrote God's Crime Scene, I thought, oh my gosh, I spent a year researching that book. I was tapped out at the end of that book. I said, I'll never write a book that was this difficult to research. But it turns out this book is maybe 5 times more difficult to research. As a matter of fact, we've got video curriculum for this book that is about, I would say, about nearly 3 hours of video curriculum. I think you're going to love it because it's much like a movie rather than video curriculum. I just hope that this book will bless you and you'll understand that Jesus impacted history in 3 ways. Number 1, he matters to history. Number 2, you can reconstruct his story from history. And number 3, history demonstrates the deity of Christ. Even if you eliminated every piece of Christian scripture, you'd still be stuck with the Jesus that we all know and love simply from the fingerprints he left on history. Thanks for joining me this week at Cold Case Christian. I'll see you right back here next week as we examine more of the case for Christianity.